Sometimes it's easy to predict the success of a movie. I don't think that anyone had any doubts that 2019's Avengers Endgame, or 2015's Star Wars The Force Awakens, or 2009's Avatar were going to be wild successes. The first was the culmination of a decade's worth of laying down groundwork. The second was the long-expected follow-up to a beloved franchise, and the third was James Cameron back in action. Other times, it's easy to predict a flop. Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis was stuck in development hell for decades, and word of mouth doomed it before it even got released. Kraven the Hunter was the third of several negatively received offshoots of Spider-Man, and The Flash was the last of the films in one incarnation of a franchise that had been routinely rejected. But in this video, I want to take a look at the surprise successes. These are the movies where I don't think anyone expected it to be as much of a success as it was. But for some reason, these movies really resonated with audiences to the tune of hundreds of millions or even more than $1 billion. Godzilla Minus One was my favorite movie of 2023, and it had some stiff competition in the form of John Wick 4, perhaps the best action movie of the 2020s so far, as well as Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse. Here was a movie that managed to merge the best of monster and man in what is, I think, Godzilla's best theatrical excursion since he first hit the big screen in 1954. Written and directed by Takashi Yamazaki and produced by Toho Studios and Robot Communications, Minus One was the 33rd Godzilla film from Toho and the 37th overall. The movie was produced on an astonishingly low budget. Some reported it as $15 million, though Yamazaki would say it was somewhere between $10 and $15 million. Production was impacted by the pandemic, which gave him several years to fine-tune his script. That was time well spent, as this is one of those movies where not a second is wasted. Each minute of the 2-hour and 5-minute long runtime is well deserved. All the fat, all the cruft was trimmed off so that all that remained was absolutely necessary to push the story along. It being a monster movie in no way lessens the impact of the serious themes that the movie deals with: guilt, trauma, redemption, PTSD, as well as the anti-nuclear message that's always an undercurrent in Godzilla movies. Godzilla Minus One would become the highest grossing Japanese Godzilla movie of all time, but it wasn't just a hit in Japan. Its popularity translated very well to the States, where critical and commercial reception were off the charts. It was hailed as one of the best movies of 2023, and with a 99% of Rotten Tomatoes, has as close to universal acclaim as you can get. Yamazaki's peers in the film industry were just as enthralled. Christopher Nolan said that it was the perfect counterpoint to Oppenheimer, while Gareth Edwards, who directed 2014's Godzilla, said, quote, "I felt jealous the whole time I was watching the movie," end quote. The movie would win a very well-deserved Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, and in doing so, Yamazaki became just the second director to win the award, preceded by Stanley Kubrick, who won it for 2001: A Space Odyssey back in 1969. That was also the only Academy Award that Kubrick ever won, so Yamazaki is in pretty good company. A sequel has apparently been greenlit, with him returning to direct, write, and handle visual effects. While past success is not a guarantee of future success, I think Godzilla is safe in his hands. Top Gun Maverick was one of my favorite movies of 2022 and is one of my favorite movies of the 2020s so far. I saw it multiple times in theaters and I enjoyed it more with each rewatch. On the surface, I don't think many people expected it to be as successful as it was. First, it was released 36 years after the first Top Gun, and while the first Top Gun certainly has a lot of fans, it's not like they were clamoring for a sequel. Second, the original director, the eminent Tony Scott, had taken his own life a decade prior to the sequel's release. Scott was a visionary filmmaker with a distinct style. You knew that you were watching a Tony Scott movie. His successor, Joseph Kosinski, certainly had a lot to live up to. Third, the movie had multiple delays. It was supposed to come out in 2019, which was pushed to 2020, which was pushed twice in 2021, before finally being released in 2022. Despite all the trials and tribulations, Maverick knocked it out of the park for pretty much everyone, critics and fans alike. The movie cleared more than $700 million in domestic sales and more than $1.4 billion globally. You don't do those kinds of numbers unless a lot of people keep going back to the theater for more. For me, the mark of a great movie is how many times I want to rewatch it, especially in theaters. And that, I think, is something that factored into its success. Maverick is a movie that's meant to be seen in theaters. It's meant to be watched with the best sound system you have access to, on the biggest screen you have access to, with people around you and without them, so you can soak in the communal experience of watching a movie and bask in its glory by yourself. Clarice Lowry, writing for The Independent, captured it well, quote, "It's the kind of edge-of-your-seat, fist-pumping spectacular that can unite an entire room full of strangers sitting in the dark and leave them with a wistful tear in their eye," end quote. "It's one of the moviest movies I've ever seen," and Entertainment Weekly's Brian Lloyd captured that part. Quote, "There are golden sunsets, perfectly crisp white t-shirts, exquisitely coiffed hair, and long-held flames of romance that make it all impossible to resist." End quote. "The movie is such a well-crafted, well-curated experience. It's the epitome of what a movie should be." As was the case for Godzilla Minus One, Joseph Kosinski's peers in the industry heaped praise on the movie. Steven Spielberg said that it, quote, "provided a true cinematic spectacle, the kind that I'd almost thought that I wasn't going to see anymore," end quote. Ridley Scott, according to producer Jerry Bruckheimer, also enjoyed the movie, with the latter saying that Scott was, quote, "laudatory in his praise for the film and the kind of care that Tom took to honor Tony throughout the movie. That was foremost in everybody's mind," end quote. Maverick is, frankly, a near-perfect movie in the vein of Godzilla Minus One. Both movies are slick, Minus One with the Godzilla of it all, and Maverick with the Top Gun of it all. Both movies had a resonant emotional core. They deal with trauma left by grief and how one moves past that. They've got some sick action sequences, but nothing is, for lack of a better word, floaty. It's not like the Marvel movies, where, sure, there are some neat effects, but none of which stay with you. Top Gun Maverick and Godzilla Minus One are fun movies that take themselves seriously, and the TLC that they got from the creators shines through. Disney's live-action remakes of their animated classics get a lot of flack. Part of it is understandable. People don't want the studio tampering with movies that they hold near and dear to their hearts. But the reason the studio keeps making them is that people keep showing up in droves for them. Several of them have made more than $1 billion, but I think 2016's The Jungle Book and 2019's The Lion King, both directed by Jon Favreau, are the most surprising hits of the bunch, though I would give the edge to the former. 2016's The Jungle Book is a live-action remake of the 1967 animated movie, both of which are adapted from Rudyard Kipling's book. Thanks to multiple re-releases, the 1967 movie has made $378 million on a $4 million budget, while the 2016 version made $967 million on a budget of as high as $177 million. Favreau, who helped kickstart the MCU into high gear, was selected as director in November of 2013, and he had carte blanche from the studio to make use of all the latest and greatest technology that they had to offer to get the look that he wanted. In his words, Alan Horn, chairman of Disney, said, quote, "Look at the technology. Look at Life of Pi, Avatar. Why not use the technology to create a whole world that transports you? Let's really embrace this new technology and see what we can do with it if we push its limit," end quote. Favreau did, and the result was a seamless merging of CGI and live action, which resulted in some of the best visual effects committed to the big screen. The movie was filmed on sound stages in Los Angeles, and the animals were entirely CGI, though real-world footage was used to get the movements right. In order to help the star, Neil Sethi, perform, they had puppeteers from Jim Henson's Creature Shop operate puppets so he could have something to act against. Those puppets were then replaced with the CGI animals. The movie was hailed by critics and audiences alike. Rotten Tomatoes' critical consensus captured it quite well. Quote, "As lovely to behold as it is engrossing to watch, The Jungle Book is the rare remake that actually improves upon its predecessors, all while setting a new standard for CGI," end quote. For most, it compared favorably to the 1967 classic, and for some, it was even better. The film had phenomenal word of mouth and was the 5th highest-grossing movie of 2016, coming in behind Zootopia and Finding Dory, both talking animal movies, as well as Rogue One and Captain America: Civil War. Disney pretty much owned the entire year. And if the movie had a bit more time, I'm certain it probably would have crested $1 billion as well. 1967's Bonnie and Clyde is one of the most important movies ever made, bar none. It's one of the movies that would help kickstart the new Hollywood movement that would gain steam in the latter half of the 60s and reach its apex in the 70s before crashing out. Directed by Arthur Penn and starring Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway as Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker respectively, the movie had a $2.5 million budget but made $70 million. This despite expectations that the movie would flop thanks to its edginess. That edginess is part of what made Bonnie and Clyde such an important movie. When the movie was made and released, the Motion Pictures Production Code, or Hays Code, was still in effect. It had been adopted decades prior as a method of self-censorship in reaction to a number of scandals that rocked Hollywood in the 1920s. But, as is always the case with any form of censorship, eventually people started pushing the boundaries before the organization that enacted it, what's now known as the MPA, abandoned it altogether. At the time, movies that depicted violence often didn't really show it. Maybe they showed someone getting shot or otherwise, but it was often a bloodless, painless affair. That was not the case with Bonnie and Clyde. While certainly not as bloody or gory as some modern films, it was a shock to the senses at the time. Even the people at Warner Brothers, including Jack Warner, did not like or understand the film. They were, for lack of a better phrase, old-fashioned. When Warner Brothers put it out, they didn't promote it much and only released it in limited markets. But then the theaters began to fill up. It wasn't until Beatty threatened to sue the studio for basically sabotaging the movie that they gave it a wide release. To their immense surprise, it was a hit. To be sure, it was a controversial movie. Bosley Crowther, the critic at the New York Times, said, quote, "It is a cheap piece of bald-faced slapstick comedy that treats the hideous depredations of that sleazy moronic pair as though they were as full of fun and frolic," end quote. Writing for The Guardian in 2007, Philip French acknowledged that the film's important, but said that, quote, "The legacy of this savage classic is that it opened the floodgates for all forms of screen violence over the next 40 years, end quote. On the other hand, Roger Ebert, then at the beginning of his career, gave it a 4 out of 4 and wrote what might have been the most prescient review of the movie. The final paragraph reads, quote, "This is pretty clearly the best American film of the year. It is also a landmark. Years from now, it is quite possible that Bonnie and Clyde will be seen as the definitive film of the 1960s, showing with sadness, humor, and unforgiving detail what one society had come to. The fact that the story is set 35 years ago doesn't mean a thing. It had to be set sometime, but it was made now, and it's about us," end quote. 2014's John Wick proved one thing, that you can still create a brand new franchise based on original material as long as you have a pair of excellent directors who know their genre, a star that's perfectly suited to the role, a writer that can create an emotional throughline, and some excellent world building that leaves the audience wanting more. The first John Wick was the epitome of a sleeper hit, and I think its popularity was mostly driven by positive word of mouth. It was a damn good movie that deserved to be seen in theaters. It's one of my most memorable movie experiences as well. I hadn't even seen a trailer for John Wick. My friends and I were looking for a movie to watch, and it usually fell on me to decide what we would see. I looked up the showtimes, saw the slick gun poster, saw it had Keanu Reeves, and we decided to watch it. It took the movie a long time to find a distributor. On the surface, it sort of makes sense. Reeves' career was at a sort of a low point. Just a year prior, he had one of the biggest bombs in film history, 47 Ronin. When producer Basil Iwanek tried to find someone to distribute it, he could only find Lionsgate, which drove a hard deal. Jason Constantine and Tim Palin, both Lionsgate execs, loved the movie and helped direct its marketing campaign, which included free screenings in dozens of cities. The movie started generating a lot of buzz based on Keanu's personal likability and the fact that it was a really good movie. By the time it came out, the action genre wasn't something of a lurch. Sure, there were superhero movies that had plenty of action, but not the kind of action that left you gobsmacked. You had the Bond movies, the Taken movies, the Bourne movies, the Mission Impossible movies, and movies like 300. But none of them came close to the intricately choreographed and grounded action that John Wick brought to the table. Here was a film that was made by people who loved movies and by people who really knew the stunt side of things. Chad Stahelski and David Leitch, the co-directors of the movie, started in stunts before eventually transitioning to directing, where their wealth of kinetic knowledge has paid dividends on excellent movies like the rest of the John Wick franchise, Atomic Blonde, Bullet Train, and The Fall Guy. Instead of using quick edits like most action movies did, John Wick lingered on the action to let the audience soak it up. Every shot, every punch, every block, every kill had an impact behind it. The action was, like Mr. Wick himself, ruthless, clean, and effective. Besides the action though, the world building in the movie deserves quite a lot of praise. Writer Derek Kolstad managed to seamlessly create an entire underground for New York City. It's to his and the duo directors' credit that there was almost zero explanation going on. John Wick might be one of the best examples of show, don't tell in movies. The rules of the world reveal themselves as the movie goes on. You come to understand that this is a world with its own currency, its own norms and mores, its own pace. The movie was an instant action classic and deserves every bit of success that it had. George Lucas has had not one, but two massive sleeper hits, and they're both worth discussing, if only for the sheer unlikeliness of it all. While his first feature film, THX 1138, was not a huge success, his follow-up, 1973's American Graffiti, was a success unlike any other. The coming-of-age film was produced by Francis Ford Coppola and included a number of actors that would go on to be famous in one way or another, including Richard Dreyfuss, Ron Howard, and Harrison Ford. It was set in the unlikeliest of all places, Modesto, California in the 1960s, where Lucas grew up. Lucas tried pitching it to a number of studios around town, but only Universal was willing to distribute it. It was a good bet. Over the years, the movie would make an astonishing $140 million on a budget of $777,000. The movie was a reaction to what Lucas felt was an issue going on with movies, including his own. In his words, quote, THX was about real things that were going on and the problems we're faced with. I realized after making THX that those problems are so real that most of us have to face those things every day, so we're in a constant state of frustration. That just makes us more depressed than we were before. So I made a film where, essentially, we can get rid of some of those frustrations, the feeling that everything seems futile, end quote. Since the budget was so small, Lucas had complete creative control over the movie. Universal tried to exert more power in post-production, wanting the movie recut, but after Francis Ford Coppola rocketed to fame thanks to The Godfather, they mostly left the movie alone. The thing that boosted Graffiti more than anything was word of mouth. Sid Sheinberg, the venerable head of Universal at the time, heard that people around the town enjoyed the movie, so they decided to expand its release and increase its marketing budget. That would end up paying dividends. It was the right movie for the right time. A rose-tinted look at the good old days, well before cynicism took over. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus captured it well. Quote, one of the most influential of all teen films, American Graffiti is a funny, nostalgic, and bittersweet look at a group of recent high school grads' last days of innocence, end quote. The success of Graffiti let Lucas shift his focus to Star Wars in earnest. The movie would go through multiple rewrites and reconfigurations, rewrites that would go on well into production because Lucas was never happy with the state of the script. Surprisingly, even after the success of American Graffiti, Lucas could not generate any interest in Star Wars. He took it to Universal, the studio he had just worked with, but they turned it down, as did every other major studio in town, including, amusingly, Disney. Finally, he found one person who was willing to take a chance on him, the head of 20th Century Fox, Alan Ladd Jr. Ladd didn't really understand the concept, which, to be fair, was pretty half-baked at the time, but he did think that Lucas had talent and decided to take a risk on that. With Star Wars, Lucas wanted to go back to his youth, to the stuff that he enjoyed when he was a kid. It turns out that, when people talk about the good old days, they're talking about a time when they were innocent, everything was simple, and they had all the time in the world to enjoy life. Serious responsibilities were assumed by their parents while they, as children, were free to dream of breaking free of the planet's gravity and exploring space. In Lucas's words, Star Wars is, quote, the flotsam and jetsam from the period when I was 12 years old. All the books and films and comics that I liked when I was a child. The plot is simple, good against evil, and the film is designed to be all the fun things and fantasy things I remember. The word for this movie is fun, end quote. Fox gave him a tiny $5 million budget, which would later be increased to $8.25 million when they started shooting. By the end of the production, the special effects budget pushed him beyond $10 million. It seems cheap now, and was cheap back then as well, but for a movie that everyone had doubts about, it was a gamble. And when I say everyone, I mean everyone. Even Lucas wasn't confident. Maybe the only person that was Lucas's friend, Steven Spielberg. Spielberg was confident that Star Wars would outperform his sci-fi movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, while Lucas was confident in the opposite. His friend made Jaws, after all, which was literally the biggest movie in the world. According to Spielberg, quote, he said, alright, I'll tell you what, I'll trade some points with you. You want to trade some points? I'll give you 2.5% of Star Wars if you give me 2.5% of Close Encounters. So I said, sure, I'll gamble with that. Great, end quote. To be fair, people had reason to doubt. The making of the movie was a pain. As soon as they started rolling in Tunisia, the area had the worst storm it had seen in decades. The entire area turned to mud, which meant delays. They ran into further delays at Elstree Studios in England, where Lucas dealt with a British crew that did not hide their disdain for him or the movie. Filming would start at 8:30 a.m., they had an hour-long lunch, and 2 tea breaks. They would always end at 5:30 p.m. Lucas could ask for 15 more minutes and it would be voted on. Lucas would always call the vote and he would always lose. Filming took several months and they were behind the entire time. In the States, these state-of-the-art special effects were slow-moving. After spending more than $1 million of the $2 million special effects budget, ILM had just a few shots. The stress landed Lucas in the hospital. Frankly, it's a miracle that Lucas was able to hit his deadline. Fox committed a bit more money and Alan Ladd Jr. was relieved when Lucas screened the movie. They had something after all. Not just something, but the movie of the decade. Thanks to word of mouth and a story that resonated with everyone, Star Wars ended up being a runaway success. Not bad for a movie that theaters actually tried their hardest to not show. One thing you might have noticed is that I didn't try too hard to try to explain why a movie was a sleeper hit. That's because, by definition, there's really no rhyme or reason. Or, rather, there's no way to reverse engineer it. Every successful movie's marketing campaign has been reverse engineered at this point, but no one in Hollywood has cracked the code to only putting out hits. People like James Cameron, Steven Spielberg, George Lucas, and Christopher Nolan have come the closest. It's not enough to just have a good movie. If that were the case, people would not complain about underrated gems. You need a good movie and a marketing strategy, sure, but it also needs to arrive at just the right moment that it can generate just enough interest to get the right people talking. If the stars align just right, you have a hit. If they don't, you don't. It's as much luck as anything, basically. Still, that also means that anyone can do it. All you really need to do is get to the finish line.